Welcome to EPG Pathashala. My name is Vidya-mitra Vasanta. I teach in the Department of Linguistics at Usmania University, Hyderabad. The lecture pertains to course number 10, Psychoneurolinguistics, module 3. It's about language learning. The focus is on socio-cultural factors. Since social or socialization processes are different from one culture to another culture, I will discuss some cross-cultural research and mention a new model of language learning that gives importance to cognitive factors, social factors and linguistic factors, multiple factors. So, let us start with the notion called Motherese. It was later termed child-directed speech. Originally, it was referred to as Motherese, but not all children are brought up only by mothers. There are fathers and their grandmothers and there is everybody. So, caretaker speech or child-directed speech, caregiver speech, baby talk. This is where we start with the notion of the role of environment in learning language. The argument of people who are foregrounding this particular concept is that the input children receive from the environment is extremely important. It's not impoverished like the linguists have said earlier. It is important. In fact, the strong form of Motherese hypothesis says that certain features in the input are necessary for language to develop. If you don't have those features, children cannot develop language properly. But the weak form of this hypothesis says certain linguistic features of speech addressed to children they do assist in language learning or language development, but they are not essential. That is a weak form. So, what are these features? Long back, Charles Ferguson, a well-known child phonologist, who studied child development, language development in children, talked about universal features of Motherese. On the screen, you will see under headings like prosody, syntax, lexicon, phonology, discourse, extended use. Under each of this heading, there are features. So, they say that no matter where we are talking about mothers or caregivers talking to children, they will use high pitch, they will use exaggerated intonation, they will talk slowly. These are the universal features of Motherese at the level of prosody. What about syntax? All Motherese, again, I choose to use one of these words, but Motherese is a little outdated, caregiver speech. Syntax level, no matter where children are being spoken to, the caregivers use short sentences. They tend to talk as though it's a telegram. They will not use complex sentences, and the level of lexicon, most child-directed speech is full of kinship terms, tata, mama, atta, that kind of relatives names and or infant games or compound verbs and things like that. At the phonological level, the caregivers try to avoid words which have clusters in them, sta, kla, kra. They will avoid that and use simple sounding words. They will try to say la for ra, or there is reduplication, mama, papu, things like that. The discourse level, they tend to ask more questions. There is a use of pronouns and shift of pronouns. In general, the discourse around the baby talk is all about animals or intimate topics and things like that. So, I just want to show you an example of an observational study of mother-child interactions that was done by somebody from our department in Usmania University in the 80s. There are three ways they have investigated, three major research methodologies have been used. One is observational or descriptive studies, second is correlational studies, and third is experimental studies. In the 70s and 80s, most research is based on observational studies. In fact, much of Ferguson's universal characteristics of Motherese are from observational studies. I just want to show you a few examples of observational study done in Telugu in our own department of linguistics here at Usmania in the 80s, I think. So on the screen you will see these examples. CF stands for features, like adult form is form, child form and adult form. AF is for adult form. So when if the speech directed to children, instead of saying the adult form AD, means which one, the caregivers tend to say OD. AD is pronounced purposely as OD when they are speaking to children, with lot of lip rounding to catch the attention of the child. Pandi means pig. Instead of saying Pandi, the adults will purposely say Bunny. They have said it. This is the data collected in a study. Bassu is pronounced by adults to the children as Bacchu. Raju is pronounced as Laju. Kitiki is pronounced as Kiki. Velu as Olu. Nidra as Didra. Butta as Butta. The difficult ta is replaced by ta. So what exactly is happening in this data? You can see there is a tendency for articulatory simplification. The adults are simplifying speech to the small children they are holding. They are talking to the children, but in a simplified fashion. And also there is a tendency to make vowels more rounded, O, like that, to catch the attention of the child. That's an example of a observational study. They have observed and recorded these features. But what would a correlational study look like? This is another study of mother-child interaction in Hindi. What these researchers have done is, these are slightly older children, and they used both free speech sample as well as game playing situation. They looked at 13 different pragmatic functions in language, such as, for instance, labeling, request, suggesting, prescription, proscription, don't do that kind of thing, phonological corrections, referential corrections, descriptions. These are all pragmatic dimensions used usually by mothers or fathers when they are speaking to children. They kept track of these dimensions, and then they gave instructions to the child. They made the parents give instruction to the child to play a game of carom board or something, some indoor game. And when they are giving these instructions, they recorded and noticed how many of these dimensions are present in the mother's speech. Then they went on to ask the child to give the instructions to another child about that game, and observed what kind of dimensions are present in the child's speech. And they tried correlating the input that the children received initially and how they are using language, whether the pragmatic dimensions present in the adult speech has influenced the dimensions in the child's speech. And what they have also done is to take two groups of mother-child pairs, mothers and children from high socioeconomic status, mothers and children from low socioeconomic status. So, and they also had two situations. One is free situation, they just allowed them to talk to each other. Another one is game playing situation. So you notice that, so the influence of situation and socioeconomic status on pragmatic dimensions used by mothers and children, they are correlated. So what they noticed is, mothers from high socioeconomic status group were seeking information from their children using requests. They tend to use more requests, whereas those from low socioeconomic status were using more prescriptions or proscriptions. They tended to use more of those dimensions, those categories of labeling kind of thing. So, and also they noticed that there is a tendency on the part of children to use more labeling in the free speech situation, irrespective of socioeconomic status of the groups. Go back to the e-text to reflect on what one can gain from studies such as this one. Now I will move on to experimental studies dealing with this topic. These experimental studies were made possible because of development of corpora of mother-child interactions. A very systematically collected electronic corpora available on the computer of mothers and children talking to each other, or even siblings. A lot of corpora is now available, and with this they are able to look at the categories like agent, action, object. They seem to be, these semantic categories seem to be more universal in terms of their presence in across languages, different mother-child interactions. These things were present, they are more universal. But features like auxiliaries, WH questions, they tended to vary quite a bit across languages. So, more information about differences across languages in mother-child interactions are emerging now with corpus-based studies. For example, corpora studies made it possible to study how the same grammatical category, let's say verb, how verb is used by caregivers and by children. Okay. So, differential verbs, the corpora studies also made it possible to differentiate verbs into two major categories. One category is called general all-purpose verbs, or GAP verbs, or GAP, if you can remember. What are general all-purpose verbs? Verbs like do, put, look. These can be used in many situations, many contexts. You can use them in a very general sense. As opposed to these gap verbs, there are non-gap verbs which contain more specific meanings. So, corpora based studies paid attention to the type of verbs and how they are used in different contexts by children and adults. What is the new insight gained out of these corpora based studies? That specific setting, what I mean by setting is whether the conversations are taking place at dinner table or during play, or while children are playing outside the home in a playground. So, different settings, that is what I mean by setting. So, different settings in which conversations take place can influence use of particular linguistic category. Okay. So, let us look little more closely at this so called setting effect. You notice the difference between gap verbs and non-gap verbs, which I have pointed out to you a few seconds ago. Which type do you think will show more setting effects? The answer is non-gap verbs. Why? Because non-gap verbs contain more specific meanings. So, they will be tied to situations. Alright. Are gap or non-gap verbs which are universal? I mean, the question of gap and non-gap verbs, are they universal? Do they behave the same way across languages? The answer is no. One has to determine which verbs have general meanings and which verbs have specific meanings across different languages. So, what are some of the conclusions from these recent corpus based studies is, one is children's language learning experience is both function of how their caregivers use language and in what settings are they using that language, how much time are they spending in those settings. Book reading for instance, it may not be that common in our context. Not all our caregivers are sitting and reading books to their children, but in Western context that is very common. We need to look at findings based on research conducted on this topic from non-Western contexts, because this module I am saying that what are the role of socio-cultural factors. So, let us now, instead of taking information about Motherese and caregiver speech and features of caregiver speech from West, let us look at some non-Western cultures, what is happening, what kind of speech styles are there. Let me say few things about that non-Western context. I will just give you one example of a study conducted in the 1990s. They included Anglo-American white middle class mother-child pairs, and they also took Kaluli and Samoan languages. They are spoken in Papua New Guinea. Mothers and children speaking Kaluli and Samoan on the other hand, non-Western languages, and Anglo-American middle class pairs. So, what they noticed is Kaluli mothers do not engage in sustained eye gaze. See, one of the things that Western research has shown is that you must speak to the person whom you must look at that person's face. But that's a Western idea. Kaluli mothers were not engaging like that. They are not looking at their children. They are not holding their children and speaking to them like that. In both Kaluli and Samoan communities, interactions are never didactic. They are never between two people. Okay, they are either triadic or multi-party. In those communities, several people talk at the same time. From early on, children have to attend to words and actions of more than one individual in the environment and learn how to enter into the interaction, how to take turns. When 3 or 4 people are talking, how do you wait? How long do you wait? When do you speak? They have to learn all that. So, the communication, the expectations from the mothers about children, how they should communicate in these communities is very different from Western communities. What are the implications of this from non-Western studies? What can we learn from non-Western studies? That language simplifying features which Ferguson pointed out are actually overemphasized. They are only based on English speaking population. The process of acquiring language is affected by process of becoming a competent member of the community. Alright, language is used to become a competent member of the community. We need to acquire all functions of language, not just one function of speaking clearly. Right? So, social distinctions are important. You must know whom you are speaking to. Whether you are speaking to an elderly person, you are speaking to a small child, the distinctions are important. And interpretations in different socially defined situations. So, language learning is therefore influenced by both social and cultural factors. So, taking into consideration these new insights, in the 90s, research on mother-child interactions, the corpus-based studies and all that, researchers developed a new model called ECM. It stands for Emergent Correlation Model. ECM model basically talks about the role of multiple cues or multiple inputs into language learning. They have emphasized on 3 major inputs: perceptual, social and linguistic, influencing early language learning in that order. Okay, so the weights of these inputs change as the child develops. All this is summarized in the picture that you are going to see on the screen next. Notice, you keep observing the picture carefully and listen to my description of the picture. Notice in phase 1, children receive attentional and perceptual cues, joint attention. The mother might draw the attention of the child to a particular object, both of them will look towards that object. So, attention plays a role in learning language. Similarly, perception also. Children are very adept at looking at the way things move differently. Alright. So, attention and perception belong to phase 1. In phase 2, social cues plays more importance, followed by language specific linguistic cues. So, what this model is saying is that word learning initially is influenced by perceptual and attentional cues. That is, children look around their environment and they pay attention to some salient aspects of the situation, and their attention is drawn to specific objects. But however strong these attention and perceptual cues are, they are not enough to disambiguate the meanings. They need little more information. So they move on to the second phase where there are certain social and linguistic cues, language specific linguistic cues. So this gap, non-gap verbs that we talked about earlier are language specific, and children slowly learn those also in disambiguating the meanings that they hear, and from that they learn and use those verbs in the adult manner. The ECM model says what is the evidence? Why should we accept ECM's model that perceptual and attentional factors followed by social factors followed by linguistic factors is what are underlying our ability to learn verbs or nouns or whatever. You can, what researchers are saying is inability to grasp social cues, social intent of the speaker results in diminished joint attentional skills, lack of eye gaze, too much of repetition, echolalia it is called, deficit in syntactic pragmatic skills. These are all characteristics of a disorder called autism. Alright. So autistic children do not make eye contact, they keep on repeating the same word, they avoid people. So in other words, when there is this dimension is not there around the age of 18 or 19, they should be picking up social cues. If they don't pick up, then they do end up getting this autism. And what they have also noticed is 29% of the autistic children, only 29% could make use of speaker's direction of gaze. See, when you hold a child, if the child is normal, the child is watching the person, what they are talking about. If they are talking about something, the child is also watching. Okay, but only 29% of the autistic children could do this, whereas 79% of normal children and 70% of even mentally retarded children could pick up the direction of the gaze, but not the autistic children. So, what they are saying that this is evidence that social cues, attention and all these cues play a role, because autistic children have language problems. So, language fails if you don't pay, if these factors are not influencing, they are not contributing, then language fails. To summarize this lecture, recall that we started with discussion about Motherese and Ferguson's points about universal features of child-directed speech, which was questioned by later researchers who looked at socio-pragmatic factors by taking a broader view of language as communication. We then talked about a model, a recent model, ECM model, which talks about multiple factors which guide language learning. Factors like attention and perception in the first stage, followed by social factors, social cues, and then finally linguistic cues. All three of them guide language learning. So, these are the main points of today's lecture. Do consult the e-text if you have any doubts. Thank you.